Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. The winter storm had already been battering the prairie for 2 days when Elias Ward pushed his horse forward through another deep snowdrift. His coat, heavy with frozen wind, pulled at his shoulders, and the cold bit into his face with each breath. Elias had been out checking the far fence line because the north rail had collapsed the week before, and he wanted to make sure the storm hadn't torn down more of his land. He didn't enjoy being out here, but he had learned long ago that a rancher who ignores his fences loses cattle, and he couldn't afford another loss. Not after the years he'd spent trying to rebuild a life that once belonged to someone else. Elias was 40, lean from long days working alone, his movements controlled and quiet. He had buried his wife, Miriam, almost 7 years earlier after she grew ill during a harsh winter much like this one. Since then, silence had become a constant companion. The cabin they had shared still held her sewing basket, her folded quilt, the kettle she always cleaned twice even when it wasn't needed. Elias kept everything in place because changing anything felt like erasing her too quickly. Today, however, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was focused on the storm and the growing concern that his horse might stumble again. He gripped the reins tightly and leaned forward, eyes narrowed against the blowing snow. A part of him wanted to turn back, but he forced himself to continue. The fence mattered, and the work gave him something steady when memories became too loud. His horse suddenly stopped. Elias felt the shift in the animal's body, as stiffening a slight tremor. He looked ahead, scanning the white haze. At first he saw nothing. Then he noticed 2 dark shapes near a cluster of wind-beaten pines. They were half buried in the snow, motionless. His heartbeat quickened. Shapes like that could be anything: dead livestock, broken logs, or something far worse. For a moment, Elias hesitated. He had found bodies before, wanderers caught in storms, men who'd pushed their luck too far. He didn't want to face another scene like that, but ignoring it would leave him with a guilt he didn't want to carry. So he nudged his horse forward. As he approached, the shapes became clearer. 2 people lying close together, their limbs stiff, their clothing frosted solid. He slid off the saddle and hurried toward them, snow crunching beneath his boots. When he knelt beside the nearest figure, he saw the woman's face, young, Apache, her eyelashes frozen shut. He placed a gloved hand near her mouth. A faint breath touched his palm. Alive. Elias felt a sharp jolt of alarm. Saving one unconscious person in this storm was difficult. Saving 2 felt nearly impossible. But he also knew he had no choice. Leaving them meant their deaths, and he couldn't carry something like that on his conscience. He checked the second woman. She was breathing too, though weaker. The 2 looked nearly identical. Same bone structure, same long dark hair, stiffened with ice, same age. Twins. Elias took a steadying breath, his mind racing. Can I get them onto the horse without hurting them more? Can the horse carry 3? Will we make it before the weather worsens? He felt fear rise in his chest, but he pushed it down. He told himself the same thing he always said when a decision pressed him too hard. Do the next thing, just the next thing. He lifted the first sister gently, surprised at how light she felt. Her body was rigid from the cold, and he moved slowly to avoid breaking fragile limbs. He settled her across the horse, securing her with his arm while trying not to startle the already anxious animal. Then he returned for the second sister, lifting her with equal care. She stirred faintly, her eyes opening a sliver, but she couldn't speak. Stay with me, Elias murmured, unsure whether she heard him. With both women secured, he mounted behind them and guided the horse toward home. The wind hit them harder on the open stretch, and Elias leaned forward to shield the sisters from the worst of it. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. They were strangers. He didn't know their story, their tribe, or what danger they had fled. But he knew they were human beings who would die if he wasted a second. His cabin appeared through the storm like a dark block rising from the snow. Relief struck him so quickly that he exhaled, shoulders sagging for a moment. He hurried the horse forward, stopped at the door, and carried each woman inside. The warmth of the cabin was minimal, just a small fire and a faint heat from the stones. Elias closed the door, locked it, and quickly set to work. He laid the sisters near the fire, wrapped them in blankets, and heated water for broth. As he tended to them, he felt his hands shaking, not from cold, but from the pressure of the situation. If they don't warm up soon, I may lose them anyway. I can't let that happen now. Not after finding them. The sisters' breathing stabilized slowly. Their eyes flickered open at different moments, both filled with fear and confusion. Elias spoke in a calm, steady voice, explaining where they were, that they were safe, and that the storm would pass. He didn't touch them more than necessary, noticing how their bodies tensed from instinctive caution. As hours passed, their condition improved enough that they drifted into natural sleep rather than unconsciousness. Elias remained beside the fire, leaning against the wall, watching them with a mixture of exhaustion and quiet responsibility. He didn't know why the prairie had placed two strangers in his path today. He didn't know how their presence would alter the rhythm of his isolated life. He only knew one thing clearly. He had brought them home, and now he had to keep them alive. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence in the cabin shift, just slightly, towards something that didn't feel like loneliness anymore. The storm pushed hard against the cabin walls through the night, rattling the windows and filling every gap with a low, steady hum. Elias stayed awake beside the fire, adding wood when the flames dropped too low and checking the sisters' breathing whenever their blankets shifted. Their faces had regained a small amount of color, and the stiffness in their fingers had eased, but the cold had left them drained. Elias watched them closely, trying to judge how much strength they had left. He knew any mistake could set back their recovery. By early morning, the sisters stirred more naturally. The firelight revealed their features clearly for the first time. High cheekbones, long dark hair thawed into tangled waves, matching eyes that opened slowly as if afraid of what they might see. The older of the two, at least by the steadiness in her gaze, tried to sit up but winced sharply, clutching her ribs. Elias moved closer, careful not to startle her. "Easy. You're safe. The cold's still in you," he said in a quiet tone. She watched him for a long moment before nodding once. Her sister woke moments later, blinking rapidly as she tried to understand the room. She reached toward the older woman, who took her hand immediately. Their connection was silent but strong. Elias realized they didn't know who he was or why he had helped them. To calm any confusion, he spoke in the same steady voice. "My name is Elias Ward. This is my home. I brought you here last night. You were close to freezing." The sisters listened without interrupting. The younger one's breathing grew tight, as if she expected danger to follow them into the cabin. Elias noticed this and shifted back a step to give them more space. He placed a pot of warm broth near them and gestured that they could take it when ready. Hunger was clear from the sharp way the younger sister glanced toward the pot, though she kept her posture guarded. Elias understood the hesitation and waited without pressure. After a few minutes, the older sister reached for the bowl. Her hands trembled, but she held the broth carefully, sipping slowly while watching Elias with deliberate caution. When she finished, she nodded toward her sister, allowing her to drink as well. The younger one obeyed, her shoulders relaxing slightly with the first real warmth she had felt in days. Elias didn't ask questions yet. Their faces already told enough: fear, exhaustion, and a deep uncertainty about what would come next. But he needed to understand their injuries. The cold had been severe, and there was a limit to what blankets and broth could fix. "Can you move your fingers?" "Your toes," he asked calmly. They tested their hands without speaking at first. Their movements were slow but responsive. Elias watched carefully, gauging their progress. The younger sister's left ankle seemed swollen beneath the blanket, so he crouched near it, showing her his hands before reaching gently. She tensed, gripping her sister's wrist, but didn't pull away. When he pressed lightly around the joint, she let out a sharp breath, signaling pain but not unbearable damage. "It'll heal," Elias said. "Just keep it wrapped and warm." They exchanged a glance, as if confirming that his intentions remained steady. Their expressions held both fear and gratitude, mixed in a way that came from people who had survived more than cold. As the morning passed, the small cabin filled with simple sounds: crackling fire, shifting blankets, Elias's steady footsteps as he checked supplies. The sisters' eyes followed him, not with suspicion now, but with curiosity. They were trying to understand the man who had brought them back from the edge of death. Elias, aware of their attention, kept his movements measured and quiet. He didn't want to overwhelm them. Eventually, the older sister looked toward the window where snow still pressed against the glass. Her brows tightened, and a faint shake of her head revealed a question Elias had already anticipated: how far they were from danger, and whether the threat they escaped could still reach them. "You're deep in the prairie. No one comes this far without a reason," Elias said, sensing the fear behind her expression. "Whatever happened out there isn't going to reach this place tonight." Her eyes lowered, as if weighing the truth of his words. The younger sister let out a breath she had been holding since waking. Elias continued tending the room, but his thoughts circled around the same concern. They weren't just lost travelers. Something had driven them into the storm. Something had left them to die. Until they chose to speak, he needed to keep them safe without pressing them too hard. He noticed another detail he had overlooked in the rush of rescue. Their clothing, though torn and frostburned, carried beadwork and patterns that matched. Their hair had been braided similarly before the cold had ruined the shape. Their movements mirrored one another. They were not only sisters, they were twins, bonded by something deeper than appearance. The older sister finally spoke, her voice low and rough from cold. "How long were we asleep?" "A few hours," Elias answered. "Long enough to breathe steady again." She nodded, then asked the next question carefully. "You live here alone?" "Yes." The younger sister studied him, likely trying to understand why a solitary rancher would risk himself in a storm to save two strangers. Elias didn't explain the decision outright, but the truth settled inside him quietly. He did it because walking away would have stayed with him for the rest of his life. When the fire grew low, he added another log. The sisters watched the flame rise, both leaning slightly toward the warmth. Their bodies relaxed in small, cautious increments. Outside, the storm continued without pause. Inside, the three of them settled into an uneasy but growing sense of safety. Nothing between them was clear yet. Not their past, not their future, not the reason fate had drawn their paths together. But Elias knew the next steps would matter. Their recovery, their trust, and whatever drove them into the snow would shape everything that came after. And with the storm sealing them inside the cabin, they had no choice but to face it together. The wind weakened by late afternoon, leaving the cabin wrapped in a heavy silence broken only by the settling of snow on the roof. Elias placed another pot on the stove, letting vegetables soften slowly while he cleaned the melted puddles near the door. The sisters rested with their backs against the wall, wrapped in blankets, their eyes following every movement in the room. Their breathing had grown steadier, but exhaustion still clung to them. When Elias finished his chores, he pulled a stool near the fire but left enough distance so they wouldn't feel crowded. He sensed they were gathering the strength to speak. Their earlier fear had softened into something quieter but still guarded. They exchanged a look, one twin silently encouraging the other to begin. The older sister lifted her chin slightly. "I am Naira," she said, her voice rough but steady. She nodded toward the younger woman beside her. "She is Talia." Elias acknowledged them with a small nod. He waited, allowing them to choose what came next. Naira continued. "We should tell you how we came to the snow. You need to know why we were alone." Talia pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if bracing herself. Her ankles still throbbed beneath the wrap, but her expression showed a deeper wound, one that had nothing to do with the cold. Naira took a careful breath. "Our band was moving toward the southern ridge. We traveled light because we thought the path was safe. It wasn't. Raiders came before dawn. They broke our camp, scattered our people, took what they could, and left many wounded." She paused, eyes lowering. "They left us behind. We were separated from the others. We tried to follow their tracks, but the storm swallowed everything." Talia nodded, adding quietly, "We walked until we couldn't walk anymore. We thought the cold would finish what the raiders started." The truth of their situation settled heavily in the room. Elias felt a tight ache in his chest, not only because of what they had endured, but because he understood the weight of being abandoned. Their voices carried the same quiet strain he had once heard in his own breath after losing his wife. He studied their faces carefully, noticing the resilience beneath the exhaustion. Naira continued, her voice tightening. We don't know who survived. We don't know who escaped. We only know we had no place to go except forward. She looked at Elias directly. Then we saw your shadow through the snow. Elias shifted on the stool, absorbing their words. Their injuries, their fear, their exhaustion, it all made sense now. The storm hadn't been their only enemy. They had been fighting long before he found them. He felt himself weigh each detail, trying to understand the scale of what the sisters had lost and what dangers might still follow. Talia spoke again, this time more firmly. You brought us here when no one else would have seen us. She wasn't offering thanks. She was stating a fact, something she had accepted quietly during the hours of recovery. Elias didn't respond immediately. His throat tightened with a mixture of responsibility and unease. He didn't want praise, but he couldn't deny that he had been the only person in a wide stretch of land who might have noticed them before the snow buried them completely. He cleared his throat and asked the question that had lingered since the moment he carried them inside. Did the raiders follow your tracks? Naira shook her head slowly. We don't think so. The storm erased everything far behind us. If they pushed north, they wouldn't know where we went. Talia looked to the window, where daylight was fading. But men like them don't stop. If they want something, they chase it. Her voice carried steady realism, not panic. Elias followed her gaze. The land outside was quiet, but he knew danger didn't always announce itself. He had seen enough conflict on the frontier to understand that fear wasn't weakness, it was awareness. He stood and fetched clean cloth from a small cabinet. I'll need to check the swelling again, he said, nodding toward Talia's ankle. She allowed it without hesitation this time. The earlier tension she felt around him had eased, replaced by the simple acceptance that she needed his help. Elias unwrapped the band gently, examining the joint. The swelling had lessened, but the skin was bruised. She winced but didn't pull away. It'll heal, Elias said. You'll be walking without trouble in a few days. Talia gave a faint nod, resting her head against the wall. When Elias finished, he returned the cloths and stirred the pot on the stove. The warm scent of vegetables and broth filled the cabin. Naira watched him with quiet attention. We had food for 2 days before the attack, she said softly. After that, nothing. Elias ladled steaming broth into wooden bowls and set them within reach. You'll get strength back soon, he said. Storm or not, there's food here. They ate slowly, savoring each bite. Their shoulders loosened, their posture shifting from defensive to something closer to relief. Talia let out the smallest breath of comfort, barely audible but clear enough for Elias to catch. When they finished their meal, Naira placed her bowl aside and spoke with more certainty than before. We are alive because you stopped your horse yesterday. That is something our people don't ignore. Elias felt the weight of her statement, but didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, unsure of what meaning she placed behind the words. The fire crackled steadily as night settled around the cabin. For the first time since arriving, the sisters looked like they believed they might see another morning. Elias checked the door latch one last time, then extinguished the lantern near the window. As he sat back down near the fire, he glanced at the 2 women leaning against the wall, wrapped together in shared warmth and shared survival. There were still many things unclear: how long they would stay, what danger might follow, and what role he would play in the days ahead. But in this moment, with the storm easing and their breathing deep and steady, the cabin no longer felt like a place reserved only for memory. It felt like a place where 3 lives had begun to move toward something new. Night passed without interruption, and by morning the storm had weakened into a slow, drifting snow that moved gently across the prairie. The cabin was cold despite the fire's steady effort, so Elias rose early to heat the stove again. He worked quietly, trying not to disturb the sisters, but both were already awake, watchful, alert, and still adjusting to a room that belonged to someone they did not yet understand. Naira attempted to stand, using the wall for balance. She moved with care, testing her muscles as if they might fail beneath her. Talia remained seated, lifting her injured ankle slightly to avoid pressure. Elias stepped toward them with measured calm. "You should take it slow," he said. "Your bodies need time." Naira gave a small nod. There was determination in her movements, not recklessness, as if she believed regaining her strength was the first step to reclaiming control of the life she had nearly lost. Elias pulled the old quilt from the cot and handed it to them. It had belonged to Miriam, sewn in the early years of their marriage, kept clean and folded even after her passing. He hesitated before offering it, wondering if he was crossing some invisible boundary in his own grief. But the sisters accepted it without question, draping it around their shoulders as naturally as if it were meant to be used again. Talia's eyes lingered on the pattern, a simple arrangement of squares, stitched carefully but unevenly in places. She traced one of the seams with her finger. "Someone worked hard on this," she said quietly. Elias nodded, swallowing the emotion that rose in his throat. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The quilt carried a history that he had never shared with anyone, but handing it to the sisters didn't feel wrong. It felt necessary. As the morning settled in, Naira insisted on helping with small tasks. She used the broom to clear melted snow and ash from the floor, while Talia folded blankets and arranged them near the fire. Their movements were slow, but growing steadier. Elias watched them closely, trying to understand how two people who had nearly died could focus so quickly on restoring some sense of order. He realized slowly that they needed structure as much as warmth. It grounded them. While they worked, Elias checked the door frame and the gaps along the walls. The storm had pushed snow into crevices, and he stuffed them tightly with cloth. Talia observed him for a long time before speaking. "You've lived here many years," she said. "You know how to survive winters like this." Elias nodded, long enough to know when to prepare and when to wait. Naira paused her sweeping, studying him. "Do you always stay alone?" He tightened the cloth in his hands. The question wasn't meant to pry. It was simple curiosity, maybe even concern, but it touched a part of him he rarely spoke about. He straightened the blanket along the door and answered with quiet honesty. "I had a wife. She passed. Since then, I live here." Naira's expression softened with understanding. Talia lowered her gaze with the same quiet respect she had shown the quilt. They didn't offer sympathy or hollow words, which Elias appreciated. They simply accepted the truth and moved on. He finished his repairs and sat by the fire with a cup of warm tea. The sisters joined him, settling opposite him with the quilt shared over their laps. Naira placed her hands close to the flames, warming them steadily. Talia tucked her injured ankle beside her, easing pressure on the joint. Elias watched their faces carefully, sensing another layer of unspoken questions behind their silence. The fear they had shown on the first night was no longer sharp, but something else remained. An uncertainty about whether they were imposing, whether they belonged, whether they should prepare to leave once their bodies healed. Before they had the chance to ask anything, Elias addressed what had been quietly hanging between them. "You don't need to worry about staying here. You're safe until you're strong enough to decide what comes next." Talia looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and relief. Naira's shoulders lowered slightly, tension easing out of her posture. "We didn't know if we would be a burden," Naira admitted. "You gave us shelter. We didn't want to take more." Elias shook his head. "If I hadn't found you, the storm would have taken you. This cabin is yours until you recover." Their expressions changed again, something small, almost like trust forming slowly from the edges inward. The day progressed with quiet activity. Elias repaired a loose hinge on the pantry door while the sisters sorted through the supplies he had stored: dried beans, flour, smoked venison. Talia counted the jars while Naira tested the sturdiness of the shelves, making sure nothing would fall. When afternoon light shifted through the frosted window, the cabin looked subtly different. The space had been rearranged, not drastically, but enough that the emptiness felt less harsh. The sisters had placed blankets neatly folded near the hearth, organized tools along the table's edge, and cleared clutter from corners that Elias had ignored for months. They worked without instruction, as if creating a space where healing could happen naturally. As they settled down to rest again, Talia leaned back and looked around the room. "Your home is strong," she said. "It feels safe." Naira nodded in agreement. "It feels alive." Elias didn't respond immediately. He looked around, noticing details he hadn't seen in years. The way the fire stretched warmth into the corners, the way the quilts softened the harsh wooden lines of the room, the way the presence of other voices shifted the air itself. For the first time since Miriam's death, the cabin didn't feel like a place frozen in grief. It felt like a place where new stories were beginning to take root. Outside, the snow continued to fall lightly, quiet and steady. Inside, three people who had survived different kinds of loss found themselves breathing in a calm that none of them had expected. Nothing had been decided about the days ahead, but the small changes in the cabin made one thing clear. They were no longer strangers passing through each other's lives. They were beginning, slowly and cautiously, to share the same space, not out of necessity, but because it felt right. By the next morning, the snow had stopped completely, leaving a pale, still landscape stretching out in all directions. The heavy clouds had thinned, allowing a muted band of sunlight to settle over the plains. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer than usual. The fire kept a steady glow, and the lingering scent of last night's meal still hung in the air. Naira was the first to rise, moving slowly but with more confidence than the day before. Talia followed, testing her ankle with careful pressure. It hurt, but the swelling had eased enough that she could place her heel down without sharp pain. Elias noticed her progress immediately. "You'll be walking normally soon," he said. Talia gave a small nod, her expression holding cautious hope. Once the morning chores began, the familiar quiet rhythm of the cabin returned, but now it included the soft sounds of the sisters' voices, subtle exchanges in their language, faint laughter when Talia misjudged her step and leaned too heavily on her sister's arm, and shared decisions about what tasks they felt able to help with. They kept their movements measured, yet each hour they grew more comfortable within the space. Elias split firewood outside, while they cleaned the small table inside, wiping the surface until the grain of the wood showed clearly again. When he returned with an armful of logs, he found the sisters arranging 2 chairs near the hearth. He had only ever kept one in daily use. The other had been pushed against the wall for years. Now the chairs sat side by side, forming a seating area that gently changed the shape of the room. It took Elias a moment to understand why the sight unsettled him. He realized he had grown accustomed to an empty seat, a reminder of the past he rarely allowed himself to examine. Seeing both chairs in use forced him to confront how long his life had been defined by absence. Yet the discomfort didn't linger in a painful way. Instead, it felt like a necessary shift, an acknowledgement that his home now held more than memory. Talia noticed his hesitation. "If it is wrong, we can move them," she said quietly. Elias shook his head. "They're fine where they are." Naira studied him carefully, recognizing the meaning in his tone. She didn't push the moment further. As the day unfolded, their interactions grew more personal. The sisters asked him questions, not probing ones, but ones that revealed genuine curiosity. They wanted to know why he had chosen a life so far from town, how long he had tended the land alone, and whether he trusted the people who lived nearby. Elias answered honestly, though sparingly, sharing pieces of his life in a way he had not done with anyone for years. In return, the sisters began revealing their own traits in small, natural ways. Naira handled tasks with quiet determination, always checking Talia's comfort before her own. She observed everything around her, the tools Elias used, the way he organized supplies, the worn parts of the cabin structure, and seemed to be evaluating how each piece contributed to survival. Talia had a warmer temperament. She asked more questions, smiled more easily, and occasionally made Elias pause with a remark that caught him off guard. When she spoke about the night they fled their band, her voice shook, yet she faced the memory with strength rather than fear. As they worked, subtle understanding passed between the three of them, small glances, moments of shared awareness, gestures that showed a growing sense of connection. Around midday, Elias prepared a simple stew. While it simmered, Naira approached him, her posture straight but her expression thoughtful. "We should repay you," she said. "You saved us. We don't want to stay without giving something back." Elias paused, unsure how to answer. "I didn't bring you here to earn anything." Naira considered his words carefully. "Where we come from, acts like yours carry meaning. Is not taken lightly." Talia joined her, looking at Elias with the same steady sincerity. "You carried us through a storm. You warmed us, fed us, kept watch when we could not stand." She hesitated before adding, "We were prepared to die. You did not let that happen." The room felt still for a moment. Elias felt the weight of their gratitude, but also something deeper, an emotional shift he hadn't expected. He wasn't used to being looked at with that kind of trust. It stirred something long buried, something he wasn't sure he could name yet. He cleared his throat softly. "You're alive. That's what matters." Naira exchanged a glance with Talia, a silent conversation passing between them. Elias noticed it but didn't interrupt. After lunch, the sisters offered to help repair the damaged corner of the roof. Elias insisted they weren't strong enough yet, but Naira refused to sit idle. They compromised. She held the tools while Elias secured the boards, and Talia handed up nails from the ground. The work slowed Elias's pace, but allowed them to feel useful again, and he didn't mind the delay. When the repairs were done, Talia rested on the cabin steps, watching the vast white plains stretching into the distance. Her face softened as she spoke. "We thought we would never see another day this calm," she said. Everything since that night was running and trying to stay alive. Elias followed her gaze. The land was quiet, but he knew calm could shift quickly out here. Still, the moment held a rare peace, stronger than the cold wind brushing against them. Naira looked toward Elias. "We did not expect kindness from a man we did not know, but we trust you. You gave us no reason to fear." Her voice didn't tremble. It carried certainty. Talia added, "We feel safe here." Elias didn't respond right away. Their words reached a part of him that had grown and used to company, and used to hearing voices that spoke without guarded caution. He found himself looking at the cabin, not as a place meant for one person, but as a space capable of sheltering more. Inside, as evening came, the sisters wrapped themselves in the quilt and sat near the fire. Elias sat opposite them, repairing the handle of an old tool. Their presence no longer felt like an interruption in his life. It felt like a quiet shift towards something unfamiliar but welcome. The night deepened around them, but the atmosphere inside the cabin held warmth. Not only from the fire, but from the steady, unspoken understanding forming between three people who had begun as strangers and were slowly moving towards something far more significant. Whatever was coming next would not be shaped by fear or obligation. It would come from a simple truth that none of them wanted to turn back to the loneliness or danger they had left behind. Morning arrived with a clear sky, the kind that settled across the prairie in a cold, steady blue. The storm had passed entirely, leaving the land open and silent. Elias stepped outside to check the pasture fence, expecting a brief walk and then a quick return to the warmth of the cabin. As he moved across the snow-packed ground, he noticed the tracks of passing deer and the faint trail where wind had swept fresh powder across the open field. Nothing suggested danger. Still, he scanned the horizon carefully. Caution had kept him alive for years. Inside the cabin, the sisters had begun their morning routine. Talia tested her ankle again, surprised by how much range she had regained. The pain was still present, but no longer sharp. Naira worked near the stove, preparing tea with a calm focus that suggested the task had become grounding for her. Their movements carried a growing sense of ownership over the space, as if they understood they were no longer temporary guests. When Elias returned, he brushed snow from his coat and stepped inside quietly. The sisters looked toward him instinctively, as if checking his expression for signs of concern. He hung his coat near the fire and washed his hands with warm water before speaking. "Fence is holding. The storm didn't break anything." Talia let out a slow breath, the tension leaving her shoulders in a visible release. For days, uncertainty had followed them, and each small piece of stability seemed to anchor them more firmly to the present. They shared a simple breakfast, stew warming over the stove, bread that Naira had helped bake with unsteady hands but growing confidence. Elias watched them move around the small kitchen space. They were steadier now, not just physically, but emotionally. Their expressions carried less fear and more quiet determination. After they finished eating, Naira sat across from Elias. She straightened her posture and folded her hands in her lap, preparing herself for a conversation she had likely rehearsed in silence. "Now that we can walk, we need to speak of what comes next," she said. Talia nodded in agreement, her gaze steady despite the uncertainty in her voice. "You said we may decide our path when we are strong enough." Elias studied them both. He had expected this moment. The land was vast, and options for two displaced women were limited and dangerous. He didn't want to influence their decision, but he couldn't ignore the tightening in his stomach at the thought of them leaving the cabin. "You're well enough to travel," he said honestly, "but the closest settlement is many miles away, and there is no guarantee anyone from your band went in that direction." Naira exchanged a look with Talia before continuing. "We have talked about this. We understand the roads. We understand the danger." Talia added with quiet certainty, "We do not wish to leave." Elias lifted his head, absorbing her words. "You want to stay here?" Talia nodded. "Yes, we feel safe with you. This home is the first place where we could breathe without fear since the attack." Naira's voice carried the same conviction. "When someone brings you back from the edge of death, it means something. We do not ignore that. Where we come from, acts like yours bind our lives to a new path. Not with force, with choice." Elias felt a shift inside him. Something slow and uncertain, but undeniably real. The idea of them remaining with him had hovered in his mind ever since he carried them through the storm. Still, hearing the words spoken aloud forced him to confront the weight of the decision. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I helped because it was the right thing to do." Naira shook her head. "This is not about debt. It is about what feels right. For us, this cabin is a place where we can heal and build something new." Talia leaned forward slightly, her eyes focused on Elias with a sincerity he hadn't seen in years. "And we trust you. That is rare." Elias looked toward the window, where sunlight glinted off the frozen ground. For years he had lived without companionship, telling himself that solitude was easier than the risk of losing someone again. The cabin had become a shelter for his memories, not a home for the living. But now, two women who had survived brutality and cold were choosing to stay, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they believed this place could be theirs too. He returned his gaze to them and felt honesty rise to the surface. "If you stay, this becomes a shared home. You won't be alone, and neither will I." Naira's expression softened, relief breaking through her composure. Talia exhaled a breath that sounded almost like release. The afternoon passed with a new sense of purpose. Elias showed them where he kept tools, supplies, and winter stores. Naira insisted on helping move heavier crates, though he guided her away from anything too strenuous. Talia organized the shelves, resting when her ankle demanded it. Their movements were steadier than before, but now carried intention, not as guests passing through, but as people preparing to settle in a place where they finally felt safe. When dusk approached, the three of them shared a quiet moment at the table. The fire cast warm light across the wooden walls, making the cabin feel fuller, more alive. Talia sipped her tea and glanced at Elias with a small, genuine smile. "We chose this place," she said simply. Naira nodded. "And we chose you." The words lingered in the room, heavy with meaning yet free of pressure. They were offering trust, partnership, and the promise of a new beginning. Elias sat back, letting the reality settle into him slowly. For the first time in many years, he felt the tightness in his chest ease, not from forgetting the past, but from accepting that life could move forward. Outside, night covered the land calm and wide. Inside, Three people who had lost nearly everything found themselves building the first steady piece of a future neither of them had expected. The following days slipped into a steady rhythm that felt almost natural. The sisters grew stronger with each passing morning. Naira's steps became sure and measured, no longer held back by fatigue, while Talia's ankle healed enough that she could walk without leaning on the furniture. Elias found himself adjusting to their presence in ways he hadn't expected, sharing tools, planning chores with them, and noticing how the cabin's silence no longer felt heavy. One evening, while Elias chopped wood behind the cabin, he noticed something wrong in the distance. A thin column of smoke rose from the northern ridge, too straight to be accidental and too far from any homestead he knew. He studied it carefully, a tightening forming in his chest. Travelers didn't pass through these plains in winter, and no rancher lived out that way. Someone unfamiliar was camped there. When he returned to the cabin, Naira immediately sensed his seriousness. "You saw something," she said, more observation than question. Elias set the wood by the door. "Smoke on the ridge. Not from settler." Talia froze slightly, her eyes sharpening with focus. "How many?" she asked quietly. "Hard to say," Elias replied, "but enough to keep a fire burning at this hour." Naira exchanged a look with her sister. The fear that flickered across Talia's face was brief but unmistakable. Elias realized they had been waiting for this possibility, waiting to see if the people who tore apart their band were still moving through the plains. Naira stepped closer to the window, watching the horizon, though nothing was visible from this angle. If they moved north after the attack, they could be near that ridge. It was a direction many of them took. Talia wrapped her arms around herself. "They don't leave survivors behind. If they learn we escaped." Elias understood. The smoke wasn't just a sign of strangers. It was a warning that danger might be closer than any of them wanted to believe. He turned to them with a calm, measured voice. "This land is open. Anyone moving through can be seen from miles away. If someone comes near the homestead, we'll know before they reach it." Naira considered his words, grounding herself. "What would you do if they come?" Elias didn't speak immediately. He ran a hand over his beard, thinking not about fear, but about responsibility. "I protect what's inside this cabin," he said simply. "That doesn't change." The sisters absorbed his response in silence. It wasn't a boast or a threat. It was a statement of intent, delivered with quiet confidence. They understood exactly what it meant. That night, Elias organized the cabin more carefully. He checked the rifle near the door, made sure the lanterns were filled, and secured the shutters. The sisters helped him without being asked. Talia folded blankets and cleared pathways across the floor. Naira sorted supplies, ensuring nothing would scatter if they needed to move quickly. Their actions were steady, not panicked, as if they had lived through danger enough times to understand the value of preparation. When Elias stepped outside one last time before nightfall, the sky had turned dark and clear. He could no longer see the smoke, but that didn't ease his mind. The ridge remained quiet, but quiet could shift quickly out here. Inside, the sisters sat near the fire. Talia rubbed her ankle absent-mindedly, her movements slow, while Naira watched Elias with a considering expression. "You've lived through loss," Naira said. "You know how to face danger without fear." Elias met her gaze. "I fear losing what's left. That's why I prepare." Talia lowered her eyes, her voice soft. "We fear the same." The firelight cast steady shadows across the cabin walls as the three of them settled into silence. An alert, watchful silence that held more understanding than words could offer. The next morning, Elias saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge, wanting to see what lay beyond it. The cold air burned his lungs, but the land was quiet, stretching wide in muted tones of winter. As he approached the ridge, he saw footprints in the snow, fresh and numerous. They trailed down the slope and curved eastward. He counted at least 5 sets. Men, armed, moving with purpose. His pulse tightened, but he forced himself to observe details carefully. Whoever they were, they hadn't come close to the homestead yet, but they were too near for comfort. When Elias returned and told the sisters what he had seen, Talia's hands stilled mid-motion. Naira's jaw tightened, her resolve forming as clearly as the lines in her face. "They're the same men," she said. "They took our band. They looked for anything they could steal. They left us because they believed the cold would finish us." Talia added, "If they learn we live, they will come again." Elias felt the weight of their fear, but he also felt something else, something steady forming within him. He had spent years believing he had no one left to lose. Now he understood how wrong he had been. "We'll be ready," he said. The sisters looked at him, not with fear, but with trust, a deep, unwavering trust shaped by everything they had survived together. As evening settled once more, the wind shifted from the east. Elias stepped outside and watched the horizon, alert to every movement. The homestead no longer belonged to one man living with memory. It belonged to three people bound by survival and choice. And if danger was coming, it would face them standing together. The next morning arrived with a hard, colorless sky. The air felt sharp, the kind that carried sound across long distances. Elias stepped outside before sunrise, scanning the ridge for any movement. The plains were empty, but something about the stillness unsettled him. Tracks didn't appear by accident. Raiders didn't travel without purpose. They were close, and they were searching. Back inside, Naira and Talia prepared the cabin without needing instruction. Naira gathered extra firewood and stacked it near the door in case they needed to barricade it. Talia secured blankets around the windows to limit visibility from outside. Their calm, focus-revealed experience. These were not women unfamiliar with danger. But even with their resolve, Elias could see the tension in their shoulders, the moments when their hands stiffened or their eyes drifted toward the door. Elias set the rifle on the table and checked each round. He felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper. He no longer lived in a home meant for one. 2 more lives depended on whether he made the right decisions. That truth sharpened every thought, every breath. Around midday, Naira approached him. "We should know what direction they travel," she said. "If they come from the east, we can see them early. If they circle behind the ridge, they may attempt to hide." "I'll ride as far as the creek," Elias replied. "That's the narrowest approach." Talia stepped forward immediately. "We won't stay here alone. If something happens, we won't know." Her words were steady, but Elias heard the fear beneath them. Not fear of fighting, fear of losing the new safety they had found. He considered this for a moment. "Then come with me," he said, "but stay behind me. And if I tell you to get back to the cabin, you go." They agreed without hesitation. They saddled the horse together and made their way toward the creek, moving slowly through the thinning snow. The land stretched wide and open, its silence building pressure in their chests. As they neared the creek bed, Elias spotted movement, shadows slipping between the sparse trees. He raised a hand for the sisters to stop. 3 men stood at the far bank, scanning the horizon. Their clothing matched the raiders' description. Mismatched coats, patched leather, rifles slung carelessly over their shoulders. Their posture held the arrogance of men who believed no one could challenge them here. Naira's breath tightened. Talia gripped the saddle so hard her knuckles whitened. Elias watched the men carefully. They were too close, too deliberate. They had followed a trail, maybe faint tracks, maybe the direction the sisters had run before the storm buried their path. One of the raiders lifted a pair of binoculars and turned toward the ridge. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they swept their gaze across the land and noticed smoke rising from a cabin that wasn't supposed to have visitors. "We go back," Elias said quietly. "Now." They returned quickly, moving with controlled urgency. Once inside the cabin, Elias secured the door and placed the rifle within arm's reach. The sisters took positions near the windows, careful not to expose themselves. Their movements carried fear, but also determination. They weren't frozen by dread. They were preparing to fight for what they had built. The sun dipped lower. The plains darkened. Then, faint at first, they heard it, footsteps crunching through snow. A shadow moved near the barn. Elias motioned for silence. The sisters held their breath. A second figure appeared near the water barrel. Then a third. The raiders had followed them. Elias positioned himself behind the window slit, watching as the first man approached the cabin door. The raider knocked once, mocking light confident. "Anyone alive in there?" he called out. Talia flinched, but Naira steadied her hand. The raider tried the latch. It held. His expression soured. When he stepped back to signal the others, Elias acted. He opened the window panel just enough to fire a warning shot that struck the snow inches from the man's boot. The raider jumped back, startled. "You come any closer," Elias called out, voice unwavering, "and you won't walk away." The three men exchanged glances, surprised to find resistance. Raiders expected fear, not readiness. "We're just looking for two lost girls," the leader said, scanning the cabin's edges. "They belong to us." Naira stiffened, fury tightening her jaw. Talia's eyes hardened. Elias stepped closer to the door. "No one here belongs to you." The leader's smirk faded. His hand twitched toward his rifle. A tense silence filled the yard. Then the raider made a mistake. He reached for his weapon too quickly. Elias fired first. The bullet struck the ground at the man's feet again, closer this time, kicking snow into his legs. It wasn't a kill shot. It was a message. The raider stumbled backward, panicked by how close the shot had landed. The others realized they were at a disadvantage. They hadn't expected someone armed, trained, and unafraid. They backed away slowly, watching the windows for movement. "Let's go," one muttered. "Ain't worth it." They retreated toward the ridge, vanishing in the fading light. Elias stayed at the door long after they disappeared, ensuring they didn't circle back. Naira approached him quietly. "You protected us," she said, her voice steady but full of something deeper: trust, gratitude, connection. Talia stepped beside her. "They won't forget this place." But today they chose to leave. Elias exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. If they return, they'll find the same answer. The sisters looked at him with unspoken understanding. The danger hadn't ended, but something had changed, something vital. They were no longer three people thrown together by chance. They were bound by choice, by survival, by the decision to stand side by side. Outside, the plains settled into darkness. Inside, the cabin glowed with the warm, steady light of a fire that no longer burned for one man alone. The night passed without the raiders' return, but the three in the cabin slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. When dawn finally broke, a faint gold line spread across the horizon, cutting through the cold air and revealing a quiet landscape untouched since the confrontation. Elias stepped outside first, scanning the ridge and the open plains for any sign of movement. The snow around the cabin remained undisturbed. No fresh footprints, no shadows near the barn, no smoke from distant fires. The raiders had moved on. When Elias returned inside, Naira and Talia were already awake, sitting near the fire. Talia's shoulders were stiff with tension, but her eyes softened when she saw Elias's calm expression. "They're gone," he said. "For now, the land is clear." Relief settled through the cabin. Talia leaned back against the wall, breathing more freely, while Naira closed her eyes for a moment, as if releasing a burden she had held too tightly. But beneath the relief came a new understanding, a realization that danger might return someday. The world outside the homestead was unpredictable, and the sisters knew too well how quickly safety could turn a threat. Elias sensed this in the way they exchanged glances, quietly evaluating the future. Instead of dwelling on fear, Elias turned to what needed to be done. "We should strengthen the cabin," he said. "Reinforce the barn, clear the snow from the roof, and check the livestock fence again." Naira stood with steady resolve. "We will help." Talia nodded. "We want this place strong too." Their words carried a deeper meaning. They weren't preparing to leave. They were preparing to belong. The three of them stepped outside together. The morning air was crisp, but sunlight warmed the snow enough that it softened under their boots. Elias took tools from the shed, handing a hammer to Naira and thick gloves to Talia. They worked without the hesitation that marked their early days in the cabin. Naira climbed onto the small stool Elias held steady and secured new planks to strengthen the window frames. Her movements were careful but confident, each strike firm. Talia shoveled away, ice gathered near the barn door, so Elias could repair the latch. She paused occasionally to rub her ankle, but her determination never faltered. Hours passed in steady cooperation. For the first time since the sisters arrived, the homestead felt like a shared effort rather than a temporary shelter. Elias watched them adapt, how Naira planned ahead to anticipate his next steps, how Talia's quiet focus matched the rhythm of his own work. Their presence no longer disrupted the way he lived, it shaped it. When afternoon arrived, Talia sat on the cabin steps, brushing snow from the hem of her clothing. She looked around at the now organized yard, firewood neatly stacked, fences visibly reinforced, barn secured, and she smiled softly. "This feels different," she said. "It feels like a place we can stay." Elias paused beside her. "It is your home as much as mine now." Talia lowered her gaze, touched by the certainty in his voice. Inside, Naira prepared a pot of stew with movements that showed familiarity with the small kitchen space. She stirred the pot without hesitation, knowing exactly where Elias kept the spices and tools. When Elias and Talia returned indoors, she offered bowls to them with the calm ease of someone who belonged in the rhythm of the room. They shared their meals seated around the table, 3 chairs now set close, no longer implying separation or temporary arrangement. As they ate, a warm quiet settled among them. There was no need to speak about the raiders, no need to revisit what had nearly been lost. Instead, they spoke of repairs they planned to make in the coming days, of how to store food more efficiently, of the possibility of expanding the small shed to hold more supplies for spring. Naira looked around the cabin thoughtfully. "This place is strong, but it can be more. We can build something better here." Elias met her gaze. "With help, yes." Talia smiled gently. "Then we help. All 3 of us." Their words weren't dramatic or ceremonial, but they carried a decision stronger than anything spoken before. For the first time, Elias felt the cabin shift, not just physically, but emotionally, becoming a lived-in home shaped by more than memories and survival. As evening approached, they continued organizing the space. Elias moved his old tools to the corner, making room for blankets the sisters had folded neatly. Naira repaired cracks in the wooden door frame with resin and cloth. Talia sorted supplies and placed them where they would be easier to reach. Every change they made together brought new life into the cabin. When night finally settled, Elias stood near the window and watched the moonlight reflect off the snow-covered land. He felt something unfamiliar, an ease, a quiet sense of belonging he had not allowed himself to feel for years. Behind him, Naira and Talia were preparing their blankets by the fire, speaking in soft tones, comfortable and warm. The cabin no longer breathed with the emptiness of solitude. It carried the steady, shared strength of 3 people who had chosen each other at a moment when their lives could have gone in separate directions. And in that calm, Elias understood something quietly profound. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a single, growing family. The morning sun rose gently over the prairie, spreading a soft warmth across the snow as it thinned into patches of melting ice. Spring was coming slowly but certainly, announced by the faint trickle of water running from the ridge and the occasional chirp of birds returning to the land. Inside the cabin, the air felt lighter, as if the long winter had finally loosened its grip. Elias stepped outside with a small sack of grain to feed the livestock. The cold nipped at his cheeks, but it no longer carried the sharp threat it once held. The land was changing, and so was his home. He paused near the barn, looking back at the cabin where Naira and Talia were already moving inside, organizing blankets, preparing the morning fire, speaking quietly to one another as they began the day's work. He realized, with a quiet certainty, that their presence no longer felt temporary. It had settled into the rhythm of his life naturally, as though the land itself had brought them together at the right moment. When he returned to the cabin, Talia was kneeling beside a crate of seeds she had found in his storage. She held a handful of them carefully, her eyes bright with curiosity. "These will grow when the frost leaves the ground," Elias said, setting down the grain sack. Talia nodded. "We can plant them soon. Food for the summer." Naira joined them, wiping flour from her hands. "If we work together, We can make this homestead stronger than before. Elias looked at the sisters, both steady, confident, standing with the ease of people who no longer feared the next sunrise. They had survived the worst of winter, the threat of raiders, and the uncertainty of a new home. Now, they stood ready for something different, a future shaped not by fear, but by choice. He felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest, not heavy, but meaningful. "There's something we should talk about," he said. The sisters exchanged a brief glance, sensing the seriousness in his tone. They followed him to the table, taking their seats as the fire crackled softly behind them. Elias sat across from them, hands resting on the wooden surface. "You've worked this land with me. You've repaired the cabin, cooked meals, tended the chores, and helped keep this place alive." He paused, searching for the right words, clear, honest, grounded. "I want this home to be yours too. Not just a place you stay, a place you belong." Talia's breath caught. Naira's eyes softened, her expression shifting to something steady and sure. Elias continued, "If you choose it, this could be our life together. As partners, as a family." Naira reached across the table, her fingers brushing lightly against the wood. "When we decided to stay, it was because we felt something here. Safety, strength, a chance to begin again." Her voice held no hesitation. "We choose this life." Talia looked at Elias, her eyes bright yet calm. "And we choose you, not out of fear or duty, because being here feels right." Their words carried everything Elias needed. He nodded slowly, relief and warmth settling into him. For years he had lived with the quiet ache of loss, believing that his life would remain unchanged, a simple existence shaped by memory and routine. But now, sitting across from two women who had survived their own tragedies, he understood that healing could happen in ways he never expected. The decision was mutual, clear, and final. They would build their lives together. As the day progressed, they worked on expanding the homestead with renewed energy. Elias marked the ground where a small extension could be added to the cabin. Naira sketched out a plan to build a new storage shed using the old lumber behind the barn. Talia cleaned the garden bed near the fence line, preparing it for the seeds they would plant once the soil thawed. Their conversation flowed easily, discussions of chores, plans for the coming months, and small moments of laughter that came naturally now. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt fragile. Their bond had grown through hardship, quiet trust, and the simple act of choosing one another. By evening, the sky glowed orange and pink over the plains. The three of them stood outside the cabin, watching the last light drift across the land. The air was cool, but no longer harsh. Spring's promise settled around them like a quiet reassurance. Naira stepped closer to Elias. "This place is stronger now," she said. "Not because of the walls or the land, but because of us." Talia smiled, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "We face whatever comes together." Elias looked at them, the sisters who had arrived as strangers and become the heart of his home. He felt no hesitation, no fear of the future, only a steady, grounded certainty. "We do," he said, "all of us." As night settled, they returned to the warm cabin, closing the door behind them. The fire burned bright, casting a steady glow across the room that now truly belonged to three people, not one. The shadows were gentle, the air warm, the future clear. The widowed Cowboy no longer lived alone. The twin Apache sisters no longer wandered without a place. Together, they had formed a family, one built on survival, trust, and the quiet decision to stay when leaving might have been easier. Their story ended not with fear or uncertainty, but with a home rebuilt, a bond chosen, and a life shared. A full, certain, and happy ending.